we are going to go ahead and let me get that PowerPoint going because, like I said, we're going to have an opportunity to get a deeper look into the different cycles. Cycles like the water cycle, the oxygen cycle, carbon cycle, nitrogen cycle. These are all things that are abiotic, but they're so essential to our ability to function as an ecosystem, right? Remember that an ecosystem is the interaction between living organisms, the biotic factors, and the abiotic factors, right? So making sure that we are really learning about the different ways that things interact with each other and how things cycle over. So again, we're going to be having an opportunity for us to watch some videos. There's going to be, I have like minute-long videos for each one of the cycles. And then you're going to be able to take that minute-long cycle, the minute-long videos and then apply your knowledge by filling out a grid. And then I'm going to have like a writing prompt at the end if we have time. So let me just quickly log in. Clearly, it has been, I need to my account. Hi, everyone. Okay. Now this should work. My internet has not been super great, so I don't know why, so that may affect the speed in which things occur. If you were in our whole group lesson yesterday, then you would have seen that. Okay, here we go. So we are going to start with the water cycle. So the different types that we're going to talk about is the nitrogen cycle. So how does nitrogen pass through the systems? The oxygen cycle, how do we move oxygen throughout the system? The water cycle, how is it possible that the water we drink is the same as what the dinosaurs drank, right? That is a true statement. So how is that possible? And then the carbon cycle. How does carbon go from something living to the emissions in the air? So understanding the carbon cycle as well. So as we go through, we are going to learn, we're going to watch this video first. Tell me if you can hear it, because I know this has been an issue in the past. So I'm hoping that this is not an issue now. Tell me if you guys can hear it. Can you hear it?
It's super quiet. So
Okay.
like you can hear the talking, but it's very quiet.
Like almost too hard to hear it, right?
Yeah, I mean you might be able to go to the volume thing and see if you can if it's all the way up.
Yeah, it is. I can find a different video if that's the case. I think I realized that needs to be a YouTube video. You don't want a song. I just want a minute-long video. If this works.
You may think every drop of rain falling from the sky or each glass of water you drink is.
Rebecca, you have to mute your mic. So here is a very quick explanation of different pathways that the water can take through the water cycle. So let's go back, and I know you guys have learned about the water cycle before, specifically because I've taught some of you guys it when you guys were in 6th grade, and it's something that is continuously shared throughout the grade levels because it's so pertinent. It's so specific to everything that we go through at every single level of science. And it's so part of our lives that we really take it for granted. So what I want for us to do, I purposefully wanted you guys to have an opportunity to do 2 things. One, there we go. I want to share the slide with you. So you guys are also going to have access. Let's see. Anyone? Edit. Okay. So I'm going to give you guys access to this slide. And that way you guys can have access directly to the video. So that video, the one that we just watched, is not the same one, but it's going to give you the same information. Let's go to slide 4. I'd like everyone to log into this and go to slide 4, please. And I want you guys to take a look at these different labels and put in order one of the cycles. So remember that it is a cycle. So water can technically start and end anywhere in the cycle. But go ahead and let's have one person at a time start going between 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, going through this cycle and take one pathway so like maybe one of the examples they included. So Kai, why don't you start us off? Where are we going to start in the water cycle? And you can choose whichever place you want to start, in the ocean, in the cloud, as a raindrop, as a snowflake, as water vapor, wherever you want to go, wherever you want to start, you get to choose. So go ahead and choose where we get to start. A river. Okay, so we're going to start with a river. So now I'm going to ask Denny, from the river, what is the next step in the water cycle? So let's say we have a little droplet, and then you guys can go directly onto slide 4 and type it in yourselves, or you can type it into the chat and I can type it in for you. But what's the next step in this cycle? Denny, you get to choose the next one. So from here, water can evaporate into the air. Okay, good. So then water droplet evaporates. Good. All right. Now let's go with Spencer. Where is that water droplet going to go now? That's okay, Denny. No worries. Okay, so then the water droplet goes to the sky. And what happens to that water droplet when it goes to the sky? It forms clouds. Great. Okay, so then Avery, go ahead and tell us next. What is the next step? So it's formed a cloud. Now what is it going to do? Okay, so the water droplet falls as rain. Great. Now, Rebecca, after the water droplet falls as rain, where is that droplet going to go?
Well, it depends where the rain is falling, because like it could fall onto like a mountain or onto the ground, or it could fall into like back into that same river itself, but it could turn into groundwater that then will go back towards a water source.
Right, let's go with that last one. So it falls onto the ground and it's infiltrated. So we call that infiltration. So whenever it falls onto the ground, like on dirt, it's called infiltration. It's going back down into the ground. And so once it goes back into the ground, so Rebecca, you did great. And so what was that last step? So it falls into the ground and onto the dirt, it goes through infiltration, and you said that it goes back to the river, right?
Yeah, it will run off of the excess water. Will run off to lower ground and usually back to a water source, because that's where like elevation is 0, because that's what how we view elevation is, you're 500 feet above sea level. So
right.
That's
Yeah, and that's where we get physics involved, right? That's that gravity working with us. So exactly. So then this is just one example. And you guys all put this together. This could have gone different directions, right? Could have gone from a river, and then that river could have gone into an ocean, right? So Rebecca mentioned something called runoff. If the water had fallen over mountains, which is often what we see living in Oregon and along the Cascades, we see a lot of river water, right? Remember that when it's rainy, we get bigger waterfalls, we get bigger runoff, and that runoff then goes down into the river, right? If we're thinking about the Columbia, and then that water that goes from the river goes into the ocean, and then it could start over again. So there are so many different ways that this water cycle could have gone. So let's go ahead and everybody go to slide 5. We've got a cycle of the water, a very in-depth one. This may be a little bit more detail than you've seen before. But we're 9th graders. We are almost sophomores. Like, you guys are 1/4 away from being sophomores. So I think we can handle it. So thinking about the different pathways, why don't you guys are all on slide 5. Perfect. Do your best to go ahead and start clicking on some of those blanks. If you click, you'll see a text box that's going to show up. Don't wait for me. You guys go and jump in there and start typing. What do you think this is? Good. Awesome. Good. So we've got precipitation. Awesome. We have condensate. Well, look at where the arrow is going, right, Avery? So you are in the right direction. I see what you're saying. Oh, wait, hold on. Hold on. I think I'm getting confused by the arrow. Okay. Keep going, Avery. Keep going. Sorry. My bad. Good. Good. So I see Avery and Rebecca on here, but I really should see a lot of others as well. I see that Kai is on this slide, so you should be typing some things in there. Denny is purple. I should see some purple. And Spencer, I don't see you on here. Oh, wait, are you on here? It's just, oh no, that's the chat. Okay. Good. Perfect. Love it, Denny. Yes. What could that be? And it's okay. There's going to be repeats, right? We've got a pretty big table here. So I just told you guys something that has to do with going into the ground. What's that word that I just taught you? Right? What's that word? Great. Love it. Love it. This word right over here. Yes. Good. Yes, Avery. Awesome. And then what does it start to turn into? So what's this thing called? Rebecca said it. It was some kind of water. Oh, okay. No problem, Spencer. If you want, you can type in stuff into the chat and I can put it on the slide. Good. Awesome. So there are some labels. Good. Groundwater. Great. What are these called? I mean, this one is probably, this one's just a label. So what is this one over here called? What are these things? What's this called? What are those things in the sky? It's a lot easier than you think it is. That would be a cloud, exactly. Yep, good, good, good. Okay, so now there's something that I want us to focus on, and that is over here. So in this one, it's pointing that the water is going from some sort of, good. I'm very impressed. That is sublimation, great. And then I want us to think about this arrow that's going from the life, right? So from trees and going into the air. So what is that called when water gets released from the leaves of the trees? Remember that stoma, we learned about the stoma because that's how carbon dioxide gets taken into the plant. It's on the underside of the leaf. But then we also talked about how it also releases gas vapor, right? Or water vapor through that as well. And we call that what? It ends with ation, right? But it's like evaporation, but it's coming from plants. You guys remember what it's called? Yes, Rebecca, it is called transpiration. Good. Awesome. Great. Let's type that in there. Good. All right. And we're going to skip this one because we've got the bulk of it. So as you can see, the water cycle is a lot more complicated than we thought, right? It's not as simple as just going, it rains, it evaporates, it goes up, it goes down. There are so many different avenues that it can take. However, it's important for us to know all of the different directions that it can go, again, because it's so important to our lives. our lives are 100% dependent on water. We know that water is a huge resource. We need it. We've learned about how we need water, how plants need water, and it's huge. And so when we take a look at this water cycle, we also need to be taking into consideration the way that human activity has been affecting it. Because everything that we do affects everything else. And anything that happens out there is going to affect us, right? So if there is too much sun, that's when we start to have drought. And that's when a lot of the water goes up into the air and is in the atmosphere, right? So keeping that in mind. So good, we understand the water cycle. Let's go into the nitrogen cycle. So again, I had a video, but now I feel like it's not going to work. So and you guys have access to this video because I linked it in the slide, and now you have the slide, so you can click on the link and watch it on your own. But because I can only play YouTube videos here, let's go ahead. And the nitrogen cycle, in my opinion, is one of the more challenging ones. So for the sake of time, I am going to choose one that's a little bit more straightforward because it can get confusing and challenging. And I really want us to focus on the main parts of it and then add on information later. So let's watch this nitrogen cycle video. Is it playing for you guys or is it paused?
It's paused. It still has like the play button on top of it.
Perfect. There we go. So again, we have a cycle that can be very complex. So this one, I would say that in order for us to be able to absorb nitrogen, there's more steps involved. So like they were saying, most of our atmosphere is made up of nitrogen. But when we inhale, we're only looking for that oxygen, right? Remember that the whole reason we breathe is just to get oxygen into our lungs for cellular respiration, right? So when it comes to getting nitrogen, it's important to understand that we can't just breathe it. We actually have to get our nitrogen through the foods that we eat. And that's how we get the nitrogen. And like the video said, the nitrogen is what we need for our DNA. It's one of those minerals and one of those elements that are really important for our body to function. So when we're talking about nitrogen, there are different pathways and different steps that need to be taken into consideration. The nitrogen is usually coming through the soil, right? That's how we get it to the different places, how we get it into our body, and how this cycle continues. So I had a simulation that I wanted us to go through together. So instead of us just filling in this cycle, let's actually go and learn about it. So I'm going to have this up on the screen, although you guys can't see it. So let me change that really quickly. Okay. So right here is going to be the simulation. And I want you guys to tell me what I should be pressing and what I should be doing. Okay. And then again, you have access to this slide. So if you wanted, you could click on the link to the simulation and follow along with me. But for now, you can tell me what you want to do, or you can do it later on your own. So let's go ahead and go through this cycle. So actually, let's go back to the intro. So nitrogen is an element essential to life. It is found in proteins, DNA, and RNA, and in chlorophyll molecules important to photosynthesis. Most living organisms cannot absorb nitrogen in its gaseous form and rely on a process called fixation to obtain nitrogen. In the following activity, roll over the elements and labels and click through the stages to learn more about fixation and other processes that take place in the nitrogen cycle. So we've got, which should we try, where should we start? Should we start with nitrogen in the atmosphere, nitrogen fixation? Where should we go? You guys tell me what to press. Anyone? Atmosphere. Okay. Nitrogen in the atmosphere. Nitrogenous gas makes up to 78% of the air in our atmosphere, which in turn holds most of the nitrogen on Earth. Good. Where should we go next? Nitrogen fixation. Great. So these nitrogen fixing bacteria supply nitrogen to the plant in a form that it can use. In exchange, the bacteria receive carbohydrates from the plant that are used to obtain energy. This is called a symbiotic relationship. A symbiotic relationship is when two organisms interact with one another. And there are different types of symbiotic relationships. There's something called mutualism, which means they both benefit. It is mutually better for them to live alongside each other. So there are bacteria that specifically live along the roots of plants. And that's because that bacteria can take and break down the nitrogen so that the plants can take up the nitrogen, and in exchange, they get the carbohydrates from the plant. So it's like this loop. They just help each other out. And there are lots of examples of that. So that's called a mutualistic symbiotic relationship. There are other types of symbiotic relationships and that we can maybe get to if it comes across. So let's go ahead, and it's going to take us through ammonification is when we've got decomposing fungi and bacteria. So it breaks down those animals when they die, and decomposers break it down even further and change it to ammonia, and then the ammonia needs to be changed into ammonium, and then it goes through nitrification, which means that the ammonium is released by going through bacteria, and it gets released into the bacteria as nitrites. And then when it goes through nitrifying bacteria, it changes it from nitrites to nitrates, and then it goes through denitrifying bacteria, which then changes it into a gaseous state and takes it back into the atmosphere. So this is why I say that the nitrogen cycle is sometimes some of the more difficult, only because It honestly, the words are so similar. Ammonia versus ammonium, nitrites versus nitrates. They are so similar, but they just signify a different step in the entire cycle. So it's important for us to know, right? So here we have an example of the cycle. So we were going through and we were understanding everything. And so now we can actually see the way that it goes. So we can go through here and then see how these change. And there are different ways that it can go. So in this example, it's telling us specifically that this element, this one element of nitrogen was taken in and went through this cycle. So then we have it going all over again, right? But it could also go through these different avenues. It can go through something called assimilation, which is when it takes up. And then we can also have it go down to when the squirrel passes in a very natural way. It then gets broken down and then goes through this process again. So we can see that the plants and the animals that we eat is how we take in the nitrogen. Okay, so this is a great example. I think that it would be awesome for you guys to take a look at this. Since you guys have access to the slides, you can look at this a little bit closer, and then you can break it down into steps and you get to control it. So we have the nitrogen fixation, which was first, and then that can go down to ammonification. And then so forth. So play around with this a little bit more when you get a chance, because it's a really great way to break it down so that you can understand the nitrogen cycle a little more. But it can be complicated. So don't be deterred though, because it is a great way to practice understanding in the different ways. Okay. So that was the water cycle and the nitrogen cycle. Do I have any questions before we move on to the oxygen cycle? Any questions so far? Okay, so then let's go into the oxygen cycle. Thank you, Kai. I was saying that the oxygen cycle is a little bit more straightforward, but there are so many things that affect the oxygen cycle. So first of all, let's take a step back. what is the whole reason we breathe and plants need oxygen? And what is the whole reason that we need that? Why do we need oxygen? Why do we breathe out carbon dioxide? What's the whole purpose? Something we learned about in quarter one. Something essential for our ability to do things. Does anyone remember? We need to make energy, right? Our cells need energy. So how does our body create energy? What's that process called? Remember? So we know that we can't make photosynthesis, right? So photosynthesis is something that plants go through to create glucose. But then we need to break that glucose down into ATP so that we can actually use that energy in our cells' function. And we need oxygen in order to go through one of the steps. What is the step that we go through in order to break down glucose into usable ATP? It's cellular respiration, right? So the whole reason we need the oxygen cycle is for cellular respiration. So now let's have everyone go to slide 9. Because even though it seems like the oxygen cycle is pretty straightforward, right? We breathe in oxygen, we breathe out carbon dioxide. Plants take in carbon dioxide and they put out oxygen. And it should be that way. However, what we're starting to see is that human impact has a really big effect on the oxygen cycle, right? So one thing that we really need to remember is that even though we have this straight directive of oxygen, we've got other things that are starting to impact our ability to put out more oxygen into the air. So in the video, they talked about deforestation. So, that was the thing here in Oregon a while back until they finally implemented that if you are going to, have produced lumber, you have to replant the trees because it takes a really long time for trees to grow. And if we just keep cutting them, we're not going to be able to replace it. And so we really start to limit our ability to put oxygen back into the atmosphere for us to have fresh air and for us to breathe better, right? And then also when we're talking about the fossil fuel combustion, which we're going to talk about in the next cycle, we also have to take into consideration that, the fossil fuel that enters the atmosphere, everything takes up space, right? And so it's going to create a higher concentration of carbon dioxide, which is oxygen in there, but not in the pure form that we can then take in as we breathe, right? And so remembering that we are not the only ones that need oxygen, right? We also know that animals need oxygen. Other sort of organisms that need to go through cellular respiration are going to need oxygen. So a lot of this, we really just need to be mindful because, again, everything affects everything, right? So it's not as easy to just say, well, if we just do this, right? If we just, do one thing, it won't be impactful because that's not the case. Everything impacts everything. So really thinking about this cycle, thinking about how it affects us, and how it affects each other. Again, this is an abiotic factor. All of these cycles are based on abiotic factors, but yet it's incredible that an abiotic factor, a factor that's not alive, can directly impact the life that we see and the life that is around us, right? So that is the oxygen cycle. Let's go into the carbon cycle. So again, let's see, is this a video on YouTube? No. Too bad, because this was a good one too. Okay, again, you have access to that video. Let's go ahead and find one to play. Totally forgot that I can only show YouTube videos. Okay, I am going to show this one for 1 minute and 17 seconds, and if it's not great, we'll just show another one. That was a very quick explanation, yeah? So again, the carbon cycle seems like it's pretty straightforward, but then we have a lot of different factors that go into it. So like they said, the carbon cycle has to do with the way that we breathe, right? Similar to the oxygen cycle, because plants are taking in carbon dioxide and we breathe out carbon dioxide. So there's this cycle, right? And then it goes into the atmosphere, and then there are animals and organisms in the ocean that take in that carbon dioxide. And like the algae and everything, and the seaweed that they were showing in the video, and they take it in. And like they said, most of the carbon is stored in rocks and sediments. So remember that rocks are made up of minerals and sediments, and there are different types of rocks. And then also within the ocean water itself. And so there are these things called reservoirs or sinks, right? We often think of it as it's like a container of where it holds something. So we think about the ocean as a carbon reservoir because that's where a lot of it is held. Now, when they were talking about the dying thing, so again, carbon can also be created by the death of an animal. So just like you can get nitrogen over a long period of time, remember that we are made up of carbon, right? They said in the very beginning of the video that carbon is the backbone of our DNA, the backbone of our bodies, right? We learned about that in Q1, that we are made up mostly up of carbon. And so once our bodies get decomposed by the bacteria, and they take the nitrogen and they turn it into those nitrites and nitrates that they can then, the plants can then absorb through their roots and through assimilation, and then that nitrogen cycle gets brought over. What we also have left over is a bunch of carbon, right? We have all these elements that are kind of stripped away. And so after a long period of time, we are then left with carbon. And so when that carbon, all of this dead matter there's this pressure that's on top of it and has been decomposing, and layer after layer has been laid on top of it, right? We call that relative dating, right? When we have the oldest layer on the bottom. And so when we talk about that, all this pressure and all this time has come past, we have this like kind of layer of living decomposed matter that's left over as carbon. And so what happens is that we have these things called fossil fuels, right? So that's where we get this idea of fossil fuels. And so what's happening is these companies dig into the earth to get the fossil fuel. And that is where we come up with oil. That's how we come up with natural gas, right? And these are the different ways that we have been using power. We get electricity from this. But what happens with that is that it gets then, once you go through combustion, which is a chemical reaction that releases that energy that we can harness and then use into creating things like our cars working or big industries pumping and getting electricity, how we get our electricity, right? What happens is the byproduct is carbon dioxide, and that gets put into our atmosphere as well. And so, like we said, like we showed in this in the oxygen cycle, more and more carbon dioxide is being put into our atmosphere, and that's affecting the way that our weather patterns look like, right? So this idea of climate change, remember that climate is different than weather, right? So our weather patterns from day to day, our climate is overall in the location. So like we are often in a temperate rainforest. We're in a temperate area over here in Oregon, meaning that we don't have drastic weather patterns. It's supposed to be pretty cool in the summer times. It's not supposed to go above 90, 95 in the summer. And we have pretty warm winters. It's not supposed to really go below freezing, below 30s. But what we're starting to see is that more and more carbon that is emitted into the atmosphere is causing a delay or a change in our weather patterns, which is changing overall our climate. And so that's why we in Oregon, where we're supposed to be having pretty temperate, meaning not so much changing weather conditions, we are having more drastic weather, right? That's why we're starting to see a lot of issues. And that's because this carbon emission has increased so much that it's affecting the cycles that we go through. And again, it's amazing that an abiotic factor, something that's not living, still has such an impact on the life that we have here, right? And so we've got this carbon cycle. So do you guys want to go ahead and try to fill it in? So I'm going to give this a little bit. I'm trying to remember where I got this. Okay, so we know that over here is going to be CO2, right? And so what happens down here? It goes into decomposing. Then we get fossil fuels, right? And remember, fossil fuels come from thousands of years of organisms dying and decomposing, being left to just carbon, right? We have, I can't remember what this one is. This one is, it goes through photosynthesis. And this goes through, all right. And so we have a couple minutes left. And so with that last minute, I want you guys to think about what your cycles look like where you live, right? So don't just limit it to your house. Think about it as your neighborhood. Think about, or just even your backyard or your neighborhood park or some sort of grassy area or your neighborhood in general. What do all of your cycles look like? Because these are not happening individually. These are all happening at the same time. I'm teaching about them individually just so we can understand exactly what's happening in each one, but these are not exclusive, right? These are all happening at the same time. So what I'm going to do now is I want you guys to choose 2 cycles, okay? And I'm going to open up the whiteboard, and I want you guys all to have access to this, okay? So in the whiteboard, I want you guys to start drawing, and then I'm going to add a couple of whiteboards. I think you guys can choose to the different ones that you can go to. So there's 1, 2, 3 of you. So there's 2, 3, and 4. So for number 2, Avery, why don't you go to number 2? Denny, you go to number 3. Spencer, you go to number 4. And I want you guys to start drawing like draw your base, right? So like, for example, let me, I'm going to take for 5. So I'm going to draw my house. Okay. In my house, I have 2 trees in my backyard. I have a bunch of plants in the front yard and along the side, and I have a few trees in the front. They're not very big, that's why I drew them. And then I have some flowers. And you guys could all be doing this on your slide as well. So I've got my flowers. I have my dog, Millie. I've got me. And so what are my cycles? So I'm going to then go and so by no means do you have to watch me do it all, but I've got my house, I've got my trees, I have a bunch of grass in the back. So I'm going to choose to do the water cycle. So I'm going to do blue to represent my water cycle. So I'm going to start with me watering my lawn. And then it's going to go in through the plants. It's going to go up through the plants. So this is called, how do you do the text? Okay, so why don't you each, can you guys get access to the whiteboards? Avery, can you start with yours? Can you choose which whiteboard to go to, or does it have to be me? Okay, no problem. I guess that is the time. So I challenge you to do this on your own time. Pick 2 of them and decide how it interacts with your surroundings, okay? All right, Spencer, do you have any questions for me? All right, well, with that, I'm gonna let you guys go. Thank you so much for joining me.